Sean Wang visited my Hollins University graphic novel class, and we were very fortunate to have him come and talk about his work, his graphic novel Runners, and there's a little preview of some of there. And then he talked about his whole Runners universe in his career. So I'll just share the interview. Yeah, so I know Sean from I'm part of a Western Massachusetts illustrators group, and even though I'm in Vermont, they still let me in. And boy, I don't come to the meetings as much the past couple of years, and I've been aware of Sean's work, but I never really uh, took a real close look at it until recently. It's so impressive, and it blows my mind how many pages. That's just like the first. That's the first issue of Runners right there, and so I'm going to just pass things over to you. Do you want to introduce yourself and talk about? I don't know if you've always been doing graphic. Was there a transition when you graduated with architecture to kind of doing over your graphic novels, or how did that work?
So can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Sean Wang. Basically, I'm a freelance illustrator and comic book writer and artist. I've been doing it for maybe 25 years. And as John was mentioning, this was not what I went to school for. So it seems like you all are kind of getting into it sooner than I did. I actually went to school at MIT for architecture. And upon graduation, realized I had zero passion for architecture. So I wanted to get into comics. At the time I was living in Boston, so I kind of reached out to a company that was based there, which was New England Comics. Very small publisher, but they were known for one character, which was the Tick, which I don't know if some people know. I have some artwork I can show, and maybe some of you might recognize him. Big blue guy with antenna.
Yeah, did he have a show briefly, or they kind of? It seemed like
Yeah, there's an Amazon show. I think I don't know if it's going on right now or. But before that, there was a short-lived Fox show with Patrick Warburton, who was Putty from Seinfeld. That's the one that's most well known. And there's a cartoon as well, way back. Um, yeah, so I reached out to them and pretty much got a job with them fairly early on, maybe mid-90s, writing and drawing for the Tick comic. I started with that, and then did a book for Image Comics called Meltdown. That it was written by a friend of mine, and then I did the artwork. And it was just kind of a limited series about a superhero with fire-based powers that were killing him. So a feel-good
killing
story.
him.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of cool. So a superhero that kind of the more he uses his power, the more like the end is his end comes near. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, and actually for me, art-wise, it was a lot of fun because the original conceit of the story was that it would start kind of light and then get darker as the series went on. And so art-wise, I kind of in the early issues did a much more cartoony style when it was kind of lighter and funner, and then slowly transitioned the artwork into like really dark and gritty and a lot more use of blacks and like sketchier lines. And so the art itself, I kind of used a bunch of different styles over the course of it. So it's kind of a fun exercise for me.
Oh, cool. And also you said you started in the mid-90s, so we're still, I mean, we talk about your technique is a lot of digital, but you started everything by hand, I assumed, and inking. Did you?
Yeah, so it was all pretty much very little was digital at the time. I think at that point it was already like I was doing the coloring, or at that point I wasn't even coloring yet. I was still just doing grayscale. So it's much more like manga influenced. And also, as I should say, other than the Image and the New England Comics stuff, which were for actual publishers, the bulk of the stuff I do is for my own sci-fi series called Runners, which this image is from that series. And it's self-published and creator-owned. So a lot of what I do is pretty much doing my own book. Back then, it was also much cheaper to print black and white as opposed to color. So I decided to go with kind of a black and white book, grayscale, old classic like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles kind of use of grayscale instead of splurging for color. So yeah, I started out doing like I would pencil on actual Bristol, which I still do now, and then I would ink on top of that, which I still do now.
Oh, you still
And
ink?
then I would, what was that?
You ink by hand. You ink all your stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
And I'll have some pages I can show of my process later. But basically, yeah, I'll pencil and ink still on Bristol. I know a lot of people work digitally now, but for me, it's like I just like being able to see it all on the page, and rather than zooming in, zooming out, scrolling over, zooming in, I just haven't played around with working digitally. A bunch of my other friends like love it, and at some point I'll probably try it. I think a lot of them, my friends who use it and recommend it do more like single page illustrations, which I think would make more sense. But for me, when I'm working on a comic page, which is like, 6 or to 8 panels, I think I just find it easier to see the whole page at once. So I still like to work traditionally.
Well, I also assume that you've got so many much perspective going on. I assume you kind of had guides from that Procreate and Photoshop can provide, but that's all you must do rulers and blue pencils, or how do you get?
Kind of. I think it was something that kind of really helped me when I was in architecture school. I feel a little lucky where I always had a bit of a knack to kind of eyeball perspective. So I can, and sometimes if you look closely, it'll be off, but I think at a glance, it'll be okay. So I usually don't do a whole lot of like the really rigid like guidelines and the vanishing points and drawing all that. A lot of times I'll just kind of eyeball and maybe just draw a light grid, kind of eyeballing it, and then do that. And I can usually, like, I have another friend of mine, David Peterson, who does a really great comic called Mouse Guard. If you haven't checked that out, you should check that out. That's one of those where the artwork is absolutely just amazing. Even before the coloring stage, I think just the black and white art is really cool. It's about like mice who are kind of warriors in this kind of anthropomorphic kind of world where they're fighting off snakes and ferrets and that sort of thing. But
this reminds me of Redwall a little bit. Is that okay?
What was that?
That reminds you of Redwall, or was that?
Yeah, I think I'm not familiar with Redwall, but I have heard other people mention that as well. But to get back to what I was saying, and I know he a lot of times will build actual physical models of some of the buildings that are in his stories as part of his world building. That's something I haven't had to do. Again, I feel kind of lucky that I can usually visualize a three-dimensional space, so I can just kind of draw it.
Well, let me ask you a question, because like the ship that your main characters are on, do you have like somewhere like a schematic of it? Because it seems like okay, this is where the cockpit is, this is where the lounge is, where they play poker. Like you must.
Yeah, I definitely it's like probably one of the last uses of my architecture degree was drawing like floor plans and some sections of the ship. For me, it was one of those things where I knew the ship was kind of like a character in the story, a place where a lot of the story would take place. So I wanted to have it all figured out, like where are the cargo holds? Like, I guess if you can see behind me, like in the front, there's like the main cargo hold, and then towards the back, you can see like there's more of the living quarters. So it was all kind of planned out where the cockpit is in relation to the living quarters and how quickly they can get from one to the other. So if they're hanging out and something happens, he can still run to the cockpit very quickly, and then the quarters are off of that. So yeah, in my graphic novel, in the back, in the sketchbook section, I do have like all the floor plans in it.
Oh, well, okay, cool. So
yeah,
I like the character sketches. I saw those in the back and stuff, and some.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I was going to mention. That like, how many of you guys are writers or artists or both? Like writers, artists.
Well, they have a range of talents, but they're all. Everyone's fantastic at least one thing. A couple of people are fantastic at a couple things, so it's really a nice eclectic mix. And I think I mentioned in the email, I think more of them are pursuing more personal kind of graphic novel stories as opposed to action. But we do have, Donald's is kind of an action superhero type of.
So is it more like the slice of life kind of like the Raina Telgemeier smile, something.
Is that doesn't they told me there
Uh,
was early on, but like Funhouse and kind of I think almost metaphorical, you know, figures telling more of a realistically grounded story, but sometimes fantasy characters. So there's
Cool. That's awesome. No, that's one of the great things about comics, that especially these days, as opposed to when I was coming up in it, where it's still mostly like you know, sci-fi stuff. Well, actually not a whole lot. Mine was kind of a rare instance of sci-fi. It was mostly like superhero stuff. But now it seems like the genres are kind of exploding as far as there's room for everything, which is really nice to see. Especially with putting it online too, if you're going to go a webcomic route. Yeah, so it's great to know that people are doing all that.
And did you start yours as a web comic, and then you decided when you had a certain number done to go, okay, I'm going to make this into a book, or was it always a web comic until you had enough to produce a book?
So the weird thing for me to think about is I actually came up with the whole series back in like the mid 90s, which is like, I think about this every now and then. I came up with it because I grew up on the original Star Wars movies and loved them. And Star Wars was actually dead at that point, which is kind of a hard thing to actually wrap your head around at this point. But it was been like, you know, 20 years since the original trilogy, and the prequels had not come out yet. So there was this dearth of sci-fi. So that's why I created mine. Oh, and just to let you know what it is, it's basically a fun sci-fi action comedy about alien smugglers. So it's kind of like the fun vibe of like Firefly, Guardians of the Galaxy, the original Star Wars trilogy, which I found was lacking at the time. So I started it way back then, and then since then the prequels came out, and then Star Wars is now, you know, ubiquitous everywhere now, as is sci-fi, which is great. Sorry, what was your original question?
I forget, but it made me think. My son's, he's 27 now, but when he was like, I don't know, 12 or 13, like every book had a dragon and a wizard in it. Like it was just like, and I was like, hey, why don't you read some science fiction? He's like, oh, what am I, nerd kind of a thing? Like, you know, everyone's into the fantasy stuff, but like science fiction was, you know, I remember we put an alien and just had no concept. Oh, they're on hyper sleep. Of course, they can't sleep. You know, all these things that were just like, I grew up reading science fiction and more Isaac Asimov probably than the you know, the Buck Rogers type of stuff. But it was just so like, what? That's just out of the
Yeah, I do
reference.
I do have the caveat that I consider mine more like space adventure, space opera, more like Star Wars, less like Star Trek or like the Asimov, you know, Arthur C. Clarke. Like it, I guess clearly looking at my image, it's not like hard science fiction.
No, you know, it's fun. It's swashbuckling.
Yeah, it's more like an adventure story set in space. So more like Star Wars, where they don't really deal with the science of science fiction. It's just more like an adventure set in space. But now I remember what your question was. Your question was about the webcomic stuff. So what I was saying was, back when I started, it kind of predated the whole webcomic thing. So when I did my comic, originally the book one, I actually released them as single floppy issues, your traditional kind of single issues that come out every month, but for me it's maybe every 3 months, and got them into comic stores, and then did the whole printing of the graphic novel. And again, the art was black and white back then, so that made it more cost effective as a self-publisher to be able to just kind of, you know, scrounge up a few thousand and then kind of get a little print run done. These days, what's great again is that the whole webcomics thing is a thing. So when I started book two, I decided to try it as a webcomic. So at that point, I loaded up my whole book one on my website, which is runnersuniverse.com. If you want to check out the comic there, I basically have the whole comic up for free, so you can read the entire series, which right now is 2 books. And book 3 just started this past Tuesday. So good timing for this, John.
Oh, you're part of the media blitz.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I'll be doing Stephen Colbert show after this.
Oh, good. Okay, good. We can try out the material here and then we'll see what.
Yeah. So with book 2, I started doing that as a webcomic after putting book 1 up. And then what's nice is I always seem to be doing stuff right before that technology comes out. That kind of helps me along. So now webcomics is a thing, which is great. It's a way to get your comic out there without being reliant on comic stores ordering it. And anyone can see it if they have a computer. And then as I was finishing book 2 is when kind of Kickstarter started taking off. Before then, I was just thinking, I guess I'll just scrabble the money together to kind of pay for the print run. But then when Kickstarter happened, then I was able to kind of run a campaign and get the book funded that way. So,
Oh, great.
And now Patreon is a thing. So I'm giving that a try and seeing how that works out. But I know that's a very tough thing for most people to actually get any kind of significant income off of. But
now, how many for Kickstarter, or even like how many donors do you get? Do you have, I guess you have follower. Like, how do you get the follower? I guess if you have a web social media presence, like
yeah,
how many followers do you have to get, and how much do they each donate to make it viable?
it's weird because it varies. I think the first time I did my Kickstarter, I personally feel it's a little different now. I think when I did my first Kickstarter, and it's a little weird because my first Kickstarter was for book 2, and then I did a later book Kickstarter for book 1. And the reason I did that was because my original book 1 was in black and white, and then I did book 2. And then I decided, as I'm relaunching the whole series and doing a whole plan, 10 books, I really need to get the first book in color. So I recolored all of book 1 and did a second Kickstarter with that. But in between the two, it felt a little different. I felt like when I did my first Kickstarter, at that point, Kickstarter was still fairly new, and a lot of people were checking it out and just kind of surfing Kickstarter, looking for cool projects. And I still think that's the case, but I do think now it's more like you need to bring your audience to Kickstarter. Like you need to build up your audience, and then those are mostly going to be the majority of the people who kind of support the project on the platform. And then you'll get the people who are surfing or people who hear about it word of mouth. But it's not like you can go on. I don't think it's as easy to go on Kickstarter as a complete unknown without an audience and just expect people to, throw a bunch of money at you. I think in earlier days, maybe. These days, it's much more reliant on you kind of building up an audience.
I think, Amanda, do you have a question? I see a little, did you have a?
I do. Hi, Sean.
Hi.
I was wondering if you could talk about the process of like self-publishing and what that was like for you for actually like physical books.
Yeah. So how about this? Do you want me to just go through my images? And some of that includes like art process stuff, and I'll see if some of that covers it, and then after see if
Yeah, sure. That sounds good. Just cover it as long as part of what you're going for. And also to add to that, I'm kind of curious, did you try the traditional getting a published route first? Or you just kind of wanted to do?
I did, and it was way back early days when I was doing the San Diego Comic-Con, and I actually remember taking it to Image Comics, and I think this goes back to like how far back it was, but I remember being told, it looks good, we like it, seems fun, but sci-fi in comics just doesn't sell. Which I still find hard to believe, because I feel like if you take a survey at a Comic-Con, how many people are there because of Star Wars? It's pretty much gonna be, most people. So I think it's that thing where maybe hard sci-fi is a bit of a harder sell, but I think space adventure in the vein of Star Wars, I think most people can find that fun.
Yeah, sure. But also if you do what's out there, like superheroes sell, but like there's 10,000 superheroes, like maybe you pick an area that's not like, I guess that frustration in publishing anywhere with picture books, and it's
and what's interesting is now Image does do, I think, a lot of sci-fi series, and a lot of other companies do as well. So I think it was me again trying to get runners going back when Star Wars was kind of dead. So the interest in sci-fi was kind of at a low, but I think now there's more interest. But I did recently shop it around again through like Dark Horse and Image and Kaboom and Boom and some of these other smaller companies. But I think it's one of those where it's like, if you're sending in like a blind submission to like whatever the address is for just mailed in submissions, I do think it just gets buried, and I don't even know who looks at those or if they look at them. So I never heard anything really, other than from, I believe it was First Second or Graphics, Scholastic. One of those did get back to me, and they said that it just wasn't really what they were looking for, which I understand. I think a lot of their books are aimed at more of like the younger kid audience. So I thought that was kind of a long shot anyway, but they were like one of the companies that I did hear back from, but most of them I, didn't hear anything. But it's one of those things where it's like, I think these days with webcomics, Kickstarter and Patreon, there is still a route outside of the traditional publisher. So I don't particularly find it disheartening. In some ways, and I think this is through like the whole WIMIG group that John and I are a part of, sometimes I think that the idea of publishers kind of freaks me out a little bit anyway. I think I've heard some stories. I think if you have like one-off stories and you just have a whole bunch of different stories, then you want to publish this one, and that, I think that can work with a publisher model. For me, it freaks me out because with my series, I have it planned as like this 10-book epic story that I've really planned out a lot of. So I have known other artists and writers who, have a whole series planned. And then if you go with a publisher and it doesn't do well, and then they decide they aren't going to do any more, but they still are sitting on kind of the rights to publish it.
Oh, huh.
Then you kind of might be in a bit of a bind where you can't do books 2 and 3 because, they have, the rights to publish them and they're choosing not to. And you also can't then take it to another publisher because they still have the rights to book 1. So how do you, so
Yeah.
in some ways that kind of thing for me with a very long ongoing series, I like having the control of it. Again, if it were just like, I have this story that I'll take to a publisher, and if something happens with it, then I have this other story, take to another publisher. I think that's a fine model. I think for a long-term thing that with my series, that, in that way, I'm kind of okay with not working with a publisher and just kind of not potentially getting into that situation. Not that I would.
Okay, that's a real good point. Yeah, I always thought that because it was with one of the picture books I did, Dinosaur Train, I kind of wanted to do a sequel, but the publisher, my editor left, and now it's kind of like, so who's going to want to do a sequel to another company's book? It's
right.
Be a tough bind. But show your sketches, show your process.
Okay, yeah. So do I, let's see.
Made you co-host, so you should be able to screen share.
Oh, okay. So screen share. Okay. All right, so can you see this?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so let's see. All right. So I'm just going to first show some of the artwork that I've done and some of the projects so you can get an idea of what I do. So this is the Tick character that I was talking about. This is just a short story I did.
Can you interrupt one question? I know traditionally, like at some point with comics, there was like a person doing the pencils, another person doing the ink, another person doing the coloring, now at this point, are you doing all of that?
Yeah, pretty much. That's another thing with the whole creator-owned self-publishing thing where I've almost always done all of it. With a lot of the Tick stuff, I would do the writing and the penciling and the inking, and then they would color it in-house and they would letter it also. For this one, I actually did all of it, like all the coloring and I think the lettering as well. I kind of forget at this point. But this, I did the coloring, and I like kind of that cartoony cel-shaded look. I've never really done a style of like that fully rendered kind of style. I find this easier, and I also just aesthetically, I like the kind of cartoony look of it.
Yeah.
So most of my stuff I've always done myself, pretty much everything. But if you go the, traditional route of working for a bigger company, then a lot of it is very specialized. You have one person doing the writing, someone else doing the penciling, someone doing the inking, someone else doing the coloring, someone doing the lettering, and then the whole company doing like the marketing and fulfillment and all that. But if you're doing the self-publishing, you have to be prepared to, a lot of the times I know most people just want to focus on creating the artwork and the story and the comic itself, but you will need to actually think about, things like marketing and fulfillment and shipping books out and promo. So there's a lot more to it if you do go the self-publishing route, but I love it. I think it's a lot of fun.
Oh, cool.
So there's this tick thing. Here's another tick cover that I did, which is him with a whole bunch of merchandise.
When you're doing panels, do you ever like have a challenge where you want, the dialogue has to go in a certain order, like this character has to say this first, then this comes second, so that kind of dictates how you position them?
Yeah, and I have some images of that a little later.
Oh, cool.
When I get into like the thumbnail stage. So yeah, and then this was on Meltdown. This was that fire-based hero who's dying. So this is an image from later in the book where I was saying the art got looser and darker and grittier. The earlier stuff actually looked more, like this style.
Huh. What kind of ink tools do you use for inking?
Oh, good question. For that, I use different things especially with my comic being a sci-fi book. I use microns, like technical pens, for the mechanical stuff. So anything that's like a background, like the ship, or like a prop, like a gun, or stuff like that, I'll use the pens. And then anything organic for like the actual characters, I'll use brush pens. So I can
What kind of brush pen do you like?
There's a variety of like just the disposable kind of Japanese brush pens that you use, and then they dry up and you throw them away. A lot of them.
Yeah, that's the problem. You like three, you do like 7 strokes with it and it's dried up. That's what.
Oh, really? I've had pretty good luck with them. Yeah. Maybe I'm just not using them as much. But yeah, I think those work pretty well. I think just a lot of what I do is for expediency. Like you'll see when I get to the pencils, I use blue pencil instead of regular, just so I don't have to erase. So that gets rid of one step. My early tick stuff, I used to use an actual brush and India ink and just that whole dipping it in, then wiping off the excess. And it's just, yeah. I like the look of it, but it's it's so much faster with the brush pen. So a lot of what I do is just what's going to be faster.
Let me just clarify one thing for some of the students may not know this. If you do the sketching with the blue pencil and then you ink it, when you scan it, you can like not scan the blue. You can adjust it later. So that's why using a blue pencil, or some people use a red pencil on too, can be a good time saver. Sorry, go on, Sean.
And then like a lot of freelance work I do is actually for Lego. They have like a magazine that they put out every other month, I guess. So I've been doing some work for them, and then also through them some kids reader books for Scholastic. So this was a fun DC Comics thing. My one time, or getting to draw DC superheroes, it was in Lego form. So that was fun. And then there's just some fun pieces that I've done on the side. This was actually for a group exhibit of the Western Mass Illustrators Guild. This was for a museum opening at the Dr. Seuss Museum.
Oh, there's the cats and hats?
Yeah, so the theme that every artist was doing was cats and hats. So I wanted to do like my Mad Max inspired post-apocalyptic cat fight where they're all fighting over that last can of tuna fish.
That's great.
And then this was just something I did for fun. Huge fan of the Lord of the Rings movies. I loved all the costumes, so I wanted an excuse to pretty much draw like every costume from the movies. So that's like a close-up of. Took forever, but it was a lot of fun.
You sell these at prints at Comic-Con and the Artist Alley, or
Yeah, which I think legally, there's the whole IP thing, but that's one of those things at Comic-Cons where it's a very gray area.
Yeah, the fan art, they're kind of,
Yeah, I think most companies realize they're not really losing money from it. And if anything, it's just kind of stoking fandom, which kind of works out for them. So I think in a lot, like technically not really on the up and up, but I think most companies tend to look the other way and don't really care. Okay, and then this is my sci-fi series, Runners. So it's basically mostly an all alien cast. And the one human looking person has this weird blue arm. So basically fun sci-fi action comedy about alien smugglers that kind of will develop into this kind of more epic war story. And then these are some of the pages from book 2. So again, this is me doing like the writing, penciling, inking, coloring in Photoshop, and lettering in Photoshop as well. Is them taking on a bunch of roach-like aliens.
Now, once you get into a rhythm, how long do you think it takes you to do like a page?
I've always been pretty quick about it. Also partly because I pencil fairly loosely because I know I'm inking over my own pencil, so they don't have to be super tight. I can usually pencil 2 pages a day, and also probably ink 2 pages a day, like pencil or ink 2 pages a day, but not pencil and ink 2 pages.
And what size are you working?
So I do. I think that the traditional comic book size is like on an 11x17 board. So I use smooth Bristol board. And then the actual drawing area is 10x15.
Huh, okay.
And you'll notice like with my artwork that I use clean gutters. Like there is also the art style of a lot of overlapping panels. Or thinking of the entire page as a composition. I tend to not do, and those sometimes, you know, the artwork bleeds off of the page on all 4 sides, and you get a lot of overlapping stuff. Sometimes I find that a little too busy. I prefer for people to be able to focus on the story that's happening inside the panels. So I actually prefer to have clean gutters and keep it, you know, easy to read without a whole lot of distracting overlapping.
Your panels are you generating the panel themselves, the rectangle squares?
In this book, if you looked really closely at the artwork at full resolution, the panel borders are a little kind of, you know, jaggy, because they are drawn with my micron pens on the actual board.
Wow.
And then I would always end up having to do some sort of cleanup and in the Photoshop stage. So that's a very good question, because these days, starting with book 3, I started drawing the panel borders themselves in Photoshop, just so it's, you know, a square shape with just a, you know, black stroke around it. And then I can, you know, pull the points out to change the shape of it depending on the page. So now it's much quicker to just have these panel borders that I can draw around each panel and not have to do that kind of cleanup work. But for the earlier books, I was hand drawing the panel borders.
I love the palette in that last
one. Thanks. Okay, so getting into the whole process. This is, I would say, unusual, so don't think other people do this or you have to do this. But for me, what I was saying was I had done 2 books already. And then a few years ago, I really wanted to figure out the whole rest of the series instead of doing it book by book, because it is a big ongoing, not ongoing, but a big 10-volume series with a whole bunch of characters. And I wanted a very specific storyline to it. So for me, I actually took a whole summer to kind of plot out the whole series. So each vertical strip is a book. So the one on the leftmost side is like book 3, and then 4, 5, 6, and then it goes up to book 10. So these are basically, for me, kind of plotting out books 3 through 10. And each color was kind of a different character or event or something. So this way I was able to track like, so these are Post-its of all these different colors. So I was able to track like a character's arc what happens to them in book 3, book 4, 5, and then, you know, where they end up in the last book. So I would say this is fairly unusual. This is more like like I hear about screenwriting in writers' rooms where you're
Oh
working
yeah,
on
I've
a
seen that.
series of TV. Were you telling me? No, I think maybe David Milgram telling me about this. There are digital apps, programs where you can do this sort of. It's almost like digital post-its where you can,
Oh,
for screenwriting, where you can kind of swap them around as well. But for me, is again like drawing on actual board, being able to see it all in front of me instead of digitally. I liked being able to, like, you know, write something on a post-it and then it doesn't really work in this story. Let's move it to, you know, a couple books later.
oh.
But this was my process anyway. So.
And do you get a discount, like bulk supply for Post-its? You get a.
It was actually oddly a lot of research trying to find out which packs of Post-its to buy to get the right colors that I actually wanted to represent the characters.
Well, on the very lower right corner of your photo, I see like a little packet there. Is that like the little Post-it?
Oh, yeah. So there are some, there's a pack there, yep, of all the different colors. And then if like slightly above that, there are a whole bunch of just loose Post-its of ones that I wrote down and then didn't quite work. So those kind of got discarded. But yeah, I think it's a fun process. And, you know, obviously this was for trying to do like 7 books at once, but I think it's worth playing with if you're writing a kind of book that may have a bunch of different things going on, just, you know, for one book, you know, having Post-its that you can shuffle around. So what happens in chapter 1, what happens in chapter, you know, 5, and you can, you know, kind of move them around easily. And I like the color coding for characters if you have that sort of thing. But yeah, for me, this works really well, but I don't think it's necessarily for everyone. And then, so this is basically what a outline for me looks like. This was my outline for the new story that's posting right now on my Runner's Universe site. At the very top in the italics, there are just a couple little things that were just notes to myself that I wanted to make sure I hit upon or kept in mind while I was writing the story. And then the rest is, and this is just page 1, the outline was actually maybe 10 pages or so total for the whole story arc. And it's just very rough, sort of the main events that happen. If there are some key bits of dialogue that I want to include that just hit me while I'm coming up with the outline, I'll throw them in also. At this point, I haven't really come up with character names, or they're just kind of stand-in names. And then these, it's the you know, keeping it very loose and kind of moving things back and forth and trying to find out. In this book and my series in particular, I have a bunch of different groups. So sometimes I'll spend time with this group and then finding when to cut to the other group and then when to come back to this other group, and jumping around. There's a lot of cutting and pasting of, you know, moving scenes around. But that is the outline. Once I have that all settled, then I move on to the actual scripting.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I guess the scripting is up to you. I used to do it in a different format, but at some point I just decided to do it as kind of like a screenplay format. I don't know if this is exactly screenplay format, but it was maybe some hybrid. So, you know, I'll have like if you're looking at the very top, the kind of setting, maybe a slight description of the action, and then, you know, the dialogue of each character. So this is pretty much the way I do it at this point. And then for me, I actually fully script the entire story before I ever draw a single page. For me, I know different artists and writers work in different ways. Sometimes some will kind of write as they draw, or they'll draw it and just kind of leave room for the word balloons and kind of figure out the exact wording when they get to that. But I like to have it all figured out. In part so I know how much room to account for in the panels themselves, which is
100%, because I find that in my sketch stage, you got to have, how big is that word balloon need to be, and can you edit down the if it's like, if there's too much type, you're gonna have to, I find I have to like really edit down what's being
Yeah.
said just so it fits in the space, and it's kind of a.
It's definitely something where the more you do it, I think when you're doing the penciling, especially if you're handling everything yourself, and if you know you're going to do the lettering yourself as well, then when you do the pencils, you really want to keep that in mind so you don't pencil yourself into a corner. Sometimes, and it goes even beyond just having enough room for a wordy balloon. A lot of it is also where you place the characters, and it's something you don't think about until you get more and more into it. But if the first character that speaks, you kind of want on the left-hand side of the panel, and then the second character to be on the right-hand panel, so that when you stack their balloons, it's a natural reading order. If you do it the opposite way, sometimes it can throw you off. So there are different considerations like that as well, and just the way you place the balloons themselves so that the actual flow of reading them makes sense.
Have you ever a situation where you get your one character on your left, you got your one on the right, but in the next scene, the guy on the right has to talk first? So how do you account for them like moving, almost like a stage director? You got to figure out a way to get them across the panel so they can say the first thing,
Yeah, there is. If you look up, there's a lot of stuff online talking about that kind of 180 rule, where you don't want, this character talking to this character, and then in the next panel they're swapped, because then the camera has gone completely around them and it's very disorienting.
Yeah.
So I can have, let's say, this character is talking with this character, and then in the next panel I can, do this, or I can do this, but they're still relatively in the same position. I could do, looking down on them, where they're still in the relative left to right position. But you usually don't want to swap them, completely.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can usually play with different angles. Like usually something like that, if the word balloon is going to get tricky, I might go with a more bird's eye view, where they're small in the frame and it gives you more room to kind of play with where you put the word balloons. So after I do the full script, then for me, and this is especially for a sci-fi thing where there's a lot of world building, I think if you're doing a lot of slice of life, then you just kind of, design the characters or their clothing or where it's going to take place. But for me as a sci-fi book, there's a lot of upfront time that goes into designing the world itself. So this was just something where it's like 3 bounty hunters that show up for maybe 2 pages, 3 pages in this book. So it's like, figuring out the heads, and then from the bodies from that, and then the costumes after that. And then, for certain characters doing like color tests. And then, so this is getting into the actual drawing of it. This is what my thumbnails look like, which my wife always laughs at and is amazed I can even tell what the hell is going on in them, because they're basically very loose, kind of chicken scratch, where sometimes even I'll come back to it later and be like, I can't tell what this was, but usually I can. So these are basically the first 4 pages of my book 3, where you'll usually see there's I don't know if you can see my cursor moving around.
I can, yeah.
Okay, so like something like this, that's the overall page. Actually, I'll go down here, it's easier. Page 4 at the bottom. I usually have one thing where I can see all the panels together. And then like I'll do on the side just different kind of angles. This was one of those things where we're talking about, John, where it's like characters, talking to each other and it gets into a fight scene. So that is like, playing around with the camera and moving it around quite a bit, more than I normally would with like a dialogue scene. So this was, and then on the next page.
Let me ask you one question also about your page layout. It looks like as runners, I got the PDF, things read as individual pages. I mean, maybe the one pointer is a spread, but are you thinking that this has to read either way, either as a row of a column of single pages, or as a spread as well? Or does it matter, like which is on the left, which is on the right for if how
I know that's actually a really good question. And I know a lot of comic writers and artists do think about that. I kind of don't. I think about it as page by page. I know a lot of people think about it where, or some people think about it where in a regular comic, you know, if you have something big that happens, you want that on the left-hand page, so that if you're looking at a 2-page spread, the big thing happens when you flip the page.
Oh yeah, I definitely like
Because
that.
otherwise, if you have a 2-page spread and you have this big thing happen on the right-hand page, you're already, when you open it up, your eye goes to that before you've read the left-hand page.
Oh yeah, 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 sure.
So there's that consideration. I don't really think about that because I'm, you know, I'm working on like for a graphic novel, 120, 150, 170 pages. So I kind of don't care to devote the kind of brain power to also thinking about what's a left-hand page and what's a right-hand page. Just sometimes if I have a double spread, then that's something different. But I usually don't think about what's on the left, what's on the right. I just think about what's on a single page.
But I think the advantage of your way is that it reads really well as a scrolling down vertically, like as a you know, that's the plus of what you're doing. Where some of my threads wouldn't work if they're divided. If you see left, then the you know.
And what's really interesting is I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with Webtoon, but that's a site where there are a whole bunch of webcomics up there. I just recently put my whole series on there as well. And it's also an app that so you can read it on your phone. And with that, you like for this with page 4 down here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 panels, and they're all on one page. But for Webtoon, I would cut that up into 6 different panels, and each one is stacked vertically. So you basically just, and you would do like maybe 15, 20, 50 panels in one big giant vertical strip. So basically on your phone, you're just kind of vertically scrolling and reading one panel at a time, one panel at a time, one panel, instead of seeing the whole page at once.
Yeah.
And when I first heard about it, it seemed kind of gimmicky. And it's like, is that how I want to read a comic, constantly, you know, scrolling? But the one thing I found is it actually lends a very interesting real-time dynamic to reading a comic, where if you want a dramatic pause, you know, the amount of time it takes to scroll and stop on a panel gives you that second, and then you scroll. So there are scenes where I make, you know, characters have a joke and then a pause where they just look at each other, maybe even that same panel repeated so they're looking at each other even longer. And then finally one of them makes a little joke in the last panel. But that time that you're taking to actually scroll is like that kind of real time that the characters are going through. It's a very interesting way to read a comic on Webtoon, and I actually really like it quite a bit now. But yeah, that's an aside with the whole vertical stacking that you were mentioning. So with page 4 down here, this is an example of once I settled on the angles and the compositions for all the different panels. This is what it would look like compared to when I actually pencil it. So if you look like in the upper left, that panel is pretty much kind of that composition. And then, you know, the very bottom right panel with this woman kneeing this guy in the stomach. That's what that is. Wow. So pretty much, you know, these 6 panels, the compositions roughly kind of translate to this.
Great hands. Now, are you like taking photographs of your hands from different angles, or do you have the hand structure down well enough to just
I kind of have it down. Hands, I will admit, are like some of the hardest things to do. What's nice is some of my aliens, these 2 have pretty normal hands, but some of my aliens have kind of wonkier alien anatomy. So it's nice I can kind of get away with, you know, not having to be true to real human anatomy. I do find it very difficult. One of the more difficult things to still get right. I end up redrawing hands quite a bit. But this you can see is that blue pencil I was talking about. And I pencil, like I was saying, pretty loosely because I know I'm going to ink it. If you're penciling and someone else is going to ink it, it would have to be a lot tighter than this. And then the reason I do blue, as John was saying, is because when I scan it in, then the blue line kind of drops out. Way back when I was working on the tick, I used to actually use regular pencil, but then I would have to, after I inked the whole thing, I would have to erase all the pencils, and that was just, that was time that I didn't need to spend if I did blue line. So after I pencil a thing, then I ink it. And then this is again using a brush for the organic things like the characters themselves, and then microns and pens for technical things like the handcuffs or like the bar setting. You can't really tell that much difference here.
But can I call attention to something for
Sure.
both for these students, and I'll probably show this to my other students too. Just your line variation. I mean, you have like thicker lines at the edges of forms, more the details, or thinner lines, and then there's things in the distance, the line gets a little thinner. I mean, there's a real hierarchy of how thick and how thin your lines are. I think you really, you do a great job of that.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, for instance, in this, the third panel, where the two of them are kind of stacked on top of each other, like the guy has like a bolder black outline, so he kind of pops out a little more against her.
It makes the space read clearly.
So the penciling and the inking I do on Bristol, and then at that point I scan them in and then start coloring in Photoshop. At this point I actually have a colorist working with me, but just so I can focus on the other stuff. But for the first two books I colored everything myself. But this is his work. But it's pretty much the same process. You're always going to start with the flats. And that's where you just do a flat color for every area that needs to be colored. And then after that, then you do like all the shading on various layers to do highlights and tints and gradients and special effects and all that. So again, this is the flats. And then this is the finished colors with like all the different effects and shading.
And
then once of that, yeah.
Sean recommended a person in the Philippines to help me color in the Julme.
Yeah.
I don't even know, is Julme a man or a woman or a couple? The picture is it
a woman? I think from her Facebook profile. But I feel like maybe there's also a guy who may also help with the flatting. But Julme, I believe, is a woman. Yeah.
Okay, so
are you still using her?
Yeah, just to explain. When I do my black and white area, I ship it to the Philippines. I have this person who, it's called color flattering. It's a weird name, but they add random colors into areas. It doesn't matter for me what colors they use. I always like it better when they don't use, if they use close to the colors I like, then I have trouble like knowing if I need to fix it. But they're just random colors. But in Photoshop, if it's an area colored in a clean selection, you can just change the colors easily. But half the battle is like coloring in the exact shape. It's like house painting, having someone come in and put masking tape around the windows. It just makes it real easy to so yeah, so I work on and she charges $10 a page, and if it's a real busy page, I give her 15. And I checked with once I was on customer service for my modem or something unrelated, and I asked the person, I said, where are you? And they said, oh, I'm in the Philippines. And I was like, oh, let me ask you a question. I'm paying someone to do work, and I give them $10 for probably 2 or 3 hours worth of work. Is that a fair? Is it? And he's like, let me think about it. Yeah, that's good. So I was worried that I was exploiting, but they say it seems to be a fair price. I know the cost of living is a lot cheaper out there, so $10 goes farther than it would here.
And I'm actually always surprised to find out, like, like I feel like we probably think for me it would be like 2 or 3 hours also, to flat something. but I think, and also much longer than that to color a page completely. And I think I find professional flatters or colors can do it so much faster.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah.
I know it saves me 2 or 3 hours, so it's worth,
Right.
that's why it's worth it, just because the time it saves me.
Yeah, that's how I feel about now working with a colorist on my book, where it's like the page rate that I'm paying is not trivial, but it would take me so much longer to color it. And given that I have, 10 books planned that I need to write pencil and ink and then do the lettering, I feel like the one thing I can farm out is the coloring. And even then, I'll still, obviously, once I get the colors from the colorist, it's fully layered so that if there are different things I want to tweak, I can do that. Like in this case, I went in and added the pattern, the sheer kind of pattern on the woman's dress, that kind of flowery
Oh, okay, yeah.
pattern. Because that was something, sometimes it's like, I don't know how to convey that to someone else to do that. So I think it'll just be easier if I do it afterwards. And there are other things like adding some highlights to like her face and different things.
Do you give them
A
a
couple
color
things here and there,
key?
but
Do you give them a color key to work from, like
I do for the characters. Like in this case, I had already done, like I'd gone through like this step of figuring out the character colors. So I gave him color guides for the characters, so the female character and then the guy, and then certain things like the bar, it's not like, for something like my ship, I would have that figured out, like the actual color scheme of everything. For a one-off location like this CD bar, I don't really care, so I just let him color it however he wanted to. And then there might be some things I would tone down, like if he came back and the sofa was too red, I might tone that down. But yeah, usually like certain backgrounds, I just kind of let the colors kind of have fun with it. But for the characters that are going to be recurring or significant characters, I will have figured out a color guide. And then this is the final stage for me, which is the lettering. And I think for for a lot of the small press books, hand lettering works fine. But I think for other books that, for me, it's like having that very kind of clean look to it, or more traditional look to it, I guess I would say. I decided to use a font. And if you're not familiar with fonts, check out a site called blambot.com. Really great site. There are two sites, Blambot and I think Comicraft, where you can buy fonts, and they have these licenses where you can use them for professional work and printing stuff, and it's all totally fine. But after you pay for the font, what's nice is Blambot has a lot of fonts that are actually free if you're using them for indie comics. So if you're one of the big companies like Marvel or DC or whatever, then they expect you to pay for it. And even then, the prices aren't exorbitant. But they have a lot of fonts that are, including like special effects fonts or sound effects fonts, that are totally free if you're doing it for an indie comic, which is great.
It's interesting. I used, I think when I did my first Fuzzy Baseball, I was debating whether to have it handwritten or use a font. And I'm so glad I went with a font, number one, because you can edit on the fly. That's the best thing about it. So I found a font that was pretty good match. I know there are some people that there are sites where you can generate a font based on your handwriting, but I found a font that was a good match for my handwriting. And it looks a lot like this. The problem was the periods were like little dashes. So everywhere there was like an exclamation point or a period or question, the dot would be like a little dash. So in the first two books, I kind of went through and just manually like put little dots. And I'm just letting it go by now. But this is a nice font. What is this?
Where did you get the font?
It was maybe DeFont. It's called Alter Ego. And I paid for, I paid for the professional. It was like $30 to be able to use it professionally.
Yeah, because it's funny you mentioned that, because this is a font that I bought many, many, many years ago from Blambot, which I like a lot, and it's called Jack Armstrong. And at the time I bought it, and they still offer this font, but I had a similar issue where their capital I, the one that doesn't have the serifs on the top and bottom, like it's just their capital I was a vertical line, but then their number 1 was also just a vertical line. And I didn't like that the two were almost exactly the same. So at that point, I actually emailed them and asked if I could pay a little bit just to have a slight customization.
Oh, wow.
So they added a little, tick to the top of the 1, so it looks like a 1. I also did a little thing where the 0 and the O looked pretty much identical. So I had the 0 just a little rounder. But yeah, so I actually contacted them because they also do custom fonts. But so for that, I just got kind of my own slightly customized version of their Jack Armstrong font. So that's what I'm using now.
As long as on that, I hope you guys don't mind us getting really into the minutia. I hope it's better. One thing I discovered, my publisher, Papercuts, they I don't know if this is industry wide, but whenever I use the letter I, the capital I with the serifs is reserved for when it's like the first person singular, like when it's I. Like I think if it's the capital at the beginning of a name, even though it's all capitals, they don't have the serifs there, like definitely not in the middle of a word, but the only place the I with the serif appears, definitely it's just with the first person singular.
Yeah, and John, I actually have this one site. I forget if it's Comicraft or Blambot associated, but it's a website that has a whole bunch of these lettering rules, and it's all tradition. So, if you don't care to follow it, that's fine. But it's a lot of stuff that is like conventions in lettering.
Yeah,
I could send that to you if you want to send it to your
Oh
students.
yeah, sure. I'd love to see it. Yeah.
Yeah, but what you're talking about is, for instance, if you look in this bottom left panel, where there's like I have the capital I up here where it has the serifs, but then down here where the word think, where it says what makes you think you can take me, that I is the kind of I without the serifs.
Yeah, that's exactly, yeah.
And that's something that I think a very sort of like people who are more seasoned will notice that if that I in think had the serifs, that's usually kind of a little marker of someone who might be new to it. And because the convention is if it is a capital I that's in a word, you don't have the serifs. You only reserve the I with serifs for like I or like FBI or something like that.
Okay. I forget, like, because I have one character whose name is Izzy, and I forget if the name begins with an I. Let me see. I forget if that's
right. So that would just be a regular I, not the one with the serif.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no serifs, just Izzy Lizardo.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll definitely send that to you because it has a lot of tips which I find very interesting. Okay, so this is the lettering page. And then, so that's it. So basically, I was going to say if you wanted to check out just my general art portfolio, it's on seanwang.com. And then if you want to check out my actual sci-fi comic, Runners, it's at runnersuniverse.com. I have the full 2 books up there. They're also up on Webtoon. And what I like about doing it as a webcomic, and a lot of other readers enjoy as well, for you guys, if as writers, you might find it interesting. At the bottom of every page, I'll usually do a little bit of commentary, and I'll talk about, in a non-spoiler way, for those who are actually invested in the story, I'll mention things like just plot decisions or the thought process that went into certain plotting decisions, characterizations. Like in this thing, on this page, I talk about how there's supposed to be this prolonged fight scene between this guy and the 3 bounty hunters, but then I ended up cutting it because there's another action scene, which I already showed you, this bar fight, which happens like just a couple pages later. And this is the more important fight of the 2. So I decided in this one just to have the fight off panel. and just implied. But there are certain things like that that I have on my site where I talk about, it's kind of like a director commentary on movies or DVDs.
Sure, yeah, yeah.
So if you like that sort of thing, you can check it out for that.
Now, did we get to, oh, I'm sorry, Amanda's question was about, did we cover that? I know it was gonna be maybe covered during the material. Did we?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, just like, so have you self-published like a physical book of your comic, or is it all just online?
Yeah, I'm still old school, so I like my comics to be physical, that I can hold. So I still print all of my books. I don't do single issues anymore. I'm toying with the idea of maybe offering with my new book, as I finish each chapter, maybe doing a digital issue on Comixology. But I find if you're self-publishing, doing a single issue and trying to get that into stores, and then once you have a collection, then no one wants the single issues anymore. It has a very limited shelf life. And it's hard to kind of move them, and they're kind of expensive. So I only print graphic novels at this point.
So what, do you use like a certain website to print them, or do you use like a company?
I use a company. It is called Taylor Specialty Books. And what's nice is they are based in the US. It might be Texas. And a couple other people in the same Western Mass Illustrators group have had their books printed there as well, with good results. So I actually recommend them quite a bit. They do paperback and hardcover. I think they specialize in hardcover, but they also do paperbacks. So with my book, I actually got it in both formats, paperback and hardcover. And what's nice with a US-based company is the shipping is much less time than the companies in China, or that work with printers in China. You could usually get a pretty good rate with those companies that work with China, but the shipping adds like another, I don't know, month or two or something. And I have heard horror stories of this past year, especially with like, ports being shut down because of, backlog due to COVID, that, creators are just waiting for their books and they just can't even get them offloaded, or, a lot of delays and that sort of thing. So I think for me, I like Taylor Specialty Books for that reason. They're based in the US. So
what is their pricing like, and do they like do any like sample printing so you can see how it'll look, or?
They usually, once you do a job with them, then they will send you proofs, and you can check the colors, and you can check, the pagination and the layout and all that. Oddly, I did have an issue with my last book that I got printed, where the proofs looked great and everything, and then they kind of sent me the books, and all the books were a little too saturated. And that was like fairly panic inducing, but I called them and pointed it out to them, and they acknowledged that there was some sort of error on their part. And I felt horrible because I actually had them come pick up this whole palette of a few thousand books and had them reprinted. But it was the sort of thing where it's like, for the amount of time I put into it and the money that I spent, I did want it to look right. I felt bad about having those books probably pulped or whatever, and it seemed very wasteful. But they were willing to do it, and they did it on their dime, and so that was the one blip that I had.
But if they're going to do a proof, they're going to give you a proof. You got to stick to the proof,
right,
know?
Exactly. Yeah. But yes, so if you do a job with them, then they will send you proofs, and then you can color correct stuff. And then if there are multiple proofs, they may charge you for it, but it's usually, not too bad. As for the actual pricing, I think the first step is you contact them, and most printers will be willing to send you a bunch of samples, like maybe a bunch of other books that they printed, so you can see what different kind of hardcover versus paperback, or this kind of cover, or this kind of paper stock, this kind of UV coating on the cover versus this other kind of coating. So there are a lot of different samples that they might send you. And then you can see what kind of paper stock you like, what kind of cover stock. And then you actually do this back and forth emailing process of like how many you want, if it's color versus black and white, actually the size of the book and the different page count. So yeah, it's kind of a back and forth process of getting kind of quotes and then revised quotes and that sort of thing. But it all varies definitely by the book. Like mine is a traditional comic book size, but if you're doing like a more manga digest format size, then that's going to be a different rate because it's a smaller book. And then obviously the page count is going to factor in.
So what's your typical? You're saying a pallet, like how many do you order at a time, like in a print run, like 1,000, 10,000, 1,000?
Oh, not that many. I think it may be like around 3,000. So it's, I think for, as far as, print runs go, it's fairly small compared to like, major books, but it's sizable compared to like some smaller press books.
And do you ship out, if someone orders, do you ship it out to them, or you give like do comic stores buy a box, or how does that?
Yeah, so once you get your books, there's a whole process for trying to get it into comic stores, and that there is currently really one distributor, Diamond Comic Distributors.
Okay.
And they're the ones who have this one big catalog called Previews that gets sent to all the comic stores, and then comic stores order from that. And then they'll order it from Diamond, Diamond orders it from you, and then you ship it to Diamond.
Okay.
At basically a third of the price generally a third of the price it will eventually be in, the cover price. So yeah, for a $20 book, which is what my books are, I think the price that I sell it to Diamond is, maybe $6 or $7. So every book that gets ordered, they pay me $6 or $7 for, because when they get it, then they sell it to the comic stores for another markup of, maybe the comic stores pay them $12 or $13 for it.
What does each book cost you to produce?
I think it might be $2 or $3.
Okay.
Maybe. So the profit per book selling to Diamonds is not super great. Maybe getting $6 for a $3 book. But a lot of the books I do sell are at conventions or from my website, and those I sell for the full $20 price. So making $17 on a book that I paid $3 for to get printed is great.
Yeah, it's so the model for making money is all over. I found with with picture books, actually with my graphic novel too. Like I can, ideally you'd love just to sit back and let the royalties roll in, but that doesn't always happen. But I can buy them, from the publisher at half price, and then if I have a school visit, I can sell like a couple hundred copies at maybe a little less than full price. And so it's almost like you make different ways to make a profit from the book aside. You gotta just sitting back and waiting for royalties, which again would be is kind of the dream, but
right,
there are other other ways to pursue it as well.
Yeah, it's definitely it's a lot of hustle if you're doing the self-published thing, because the other thing is a lot of your sales more of your sales may be from conventions, if you decide to do conventions, than comic stores. Comic stores are tough, understandably so. They're struggling. Comics aren't huge business, and I think a lot of their money they have to spend on the big Marvel and DC superhero books, which are their bread and butter.
Do they always buy the merchandise, or is it ever on consignment? Or that must be a pain to keep track of, I would think.
I usually don't bother with consignment unless it's like if it were a local store back when like Modern Myths was here. I don't think they ever did consignment either for my books. They would just buy them. Yeah, I think that would be more of a pain to track. But yeah, I find that stores are tough because they don't have a whole lot of money to spend. So they're very reluctant to buy a whole lot of a book from a creator they don't know, or something that doesn't already have a proven track record. So, it can be frustrating, but I think that's, the whole grind of it is just trying to see what you can do to build it up and build up awareness and a readership and, doing shows and trying to build up your audience there. And like I was saying before, the fact that webcomics are a thing now is just so much better than it used to be. Because before, if you created, like back in my early days, when I did the single issues of my first book, and webcomics were not an option, if I did the single issues and I offered them to stores and the stores didn't order them, then readers had no chance of seeing them, because readers, go into a comic store and flip through what's on the shelf and buy what looks good. But if it never even makes it to the shelf, then there's no way for anyone to discover it. But now with a webcomic, you can put it online. And it's still hard to cut through the clutter because there are so many webcomics and, trying to get people to give it a chance. But it's possible. You don't have the bottleneck of the store at this point.
Do you feel like you have a certain core group of, I'll call them patrons or supporters or Kickstarter people who like you kind of can guarantee, like who like, well, next we put one out, it's a guaranteed number of sales?
Yeah, I think I have maybe like right now up to about 5,000 subscribers on Webtoon. And I don't know what my readership is on my Runner's Universe site. Unfortunately, I kind of built up a bit of a readership with book 2. And then I had a whole lot of the Lego freelance work for a number of years and kind of focused on that. So it's actually been several years since I've touched the comic. And then there are a number of years where I, took to plot out the whole remaining 8 books. And so there's a lot of ramping it back up, during which time I think I probably lost a bunch of readers. So that's unfortunate. One thing to keep in mind if you do go the webcomic route, and this is very important, is trying to figure out what a regular schedule is that you can keep. I think webcomics really live and die off of consistency, and readers, being able to come back and know that you're going to have a new one, a new page. But if they come back and month after month after month, it's just there hasn't been anything new, then they might move on to something new. So I do feel like that happened with my series, where I went like years without really doing anything because I was focusing on the freelance. So now part of it I feel like is kind of building it up back, not entirely from scratch, but a little bit like that. But I do have a lot of readers who have followed it and have been waiting for more and have been, patiently waiting for more, and they're just happy to back it on Patreon and are still here. And that's very rewarding to know that it made that much of an impression with people that they are still, happy to wait for it.
Oh, cool. Oh, great. Well, boy, you spent so much time. Appreciate all the time you spent with us. Does anybody have any last minute questions? Anything else that we didn't cover that you want to ask? Okay, but maybe if we leave screen share, we can go back to gallery view. We can see the faces.
Okay.
Okay, well, yeah, it's been. I hope you guys. I think some of you maybe enjoyed the details, the deep dive. I'm sure it's. I apologize for those. It seems like part of a different subculture or foreign language or something, but I feel like I learned a lot, and it was great to know more about your work, Sean. I appreciate you spending time with us this morning.
Yeah, it was fun. I hope it wasn't too much in the details of things.
No, just like as a big buffet, if something useful, take what you want. I think it was good just to, I think it was good to go deep dive, even if, you never know what's going to click. Um, and people know.
Yeah, and I'll send you that link to the whole lettering thing that I was talking about, John. And then also my email, and then I guess if anyone has additional questions or follow-ups, I'm happy to answer them.
Oh, great. Okay.
Oh yeah, and check out Runners on Runners Universe.
Oh, sure. Yeah, definitely. It's a fun, it's definitely, I'm looking at, how come they didn't make a movie out of this yet? How come it definitely seems like, I'm just shocked that you send things out to like First Second or Graphics or any place. They don't jump on, it just seems like better than a whole lot of what I've seen out there. I don't know.
I do think with those companies, I kind of understand it, because looking at their books, I do think they skew more towards a younger audience than what I'm doing. And mine is, I think it's good, but I think it is a more traditional kind of adventure story than probably what, I think it's more like a traditional conventional comic book series than what First Second and Graphics are doing. So I understand that. I'm more surprised at like Image or Dark Horse, because I think I've actually had a lot of my readers say, why is this not an Image book? So I think it would easily fit in with what they're doing. I do think it comes down a lot to like, they're probably inundated with submissions. So unless I'm submitting it to them over and over and over again, and hoping someone opens the envelope and actually checks it out, I'm not convinced that they actually look at everything that comes through.
Yeah.
But then, like I said, between webcomics and Kickstarter and Patreon, I do think there is an avenue there. I hope I'm right about that.
Yeah.
But it seems like there's an option to, talking with some of the children's book writers and artists in our group. I feel worse for them that they're in a bind where I think outside of traditional book publishing, I think in that industry, there is still some sort of looking down on self-publishing. Like, that wasn't good enough to be picked up by a publisher, so they had to self-publish. But I think within the comics world, it's very common. With Bone, that was a self-publisher. Cerebus, there are so many creator-owned books that have been very well received that I don't think it has the stigma to it that I think in other industries it might. So I think that's a really good thing about comics.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I've done a few projects for people who self-publish, and the hard part, I mean, distribution's always you can produce the book, you can make it look professional, but just getting it out there and selling it is always the biggest obstacle. I did sell her book, so everyone kind of has their venue that they think is going to help them sell, and that's that's always the sticking point. But then like books like Pete the Cat, which is, teachers probably know, I think that started as a self-published thing, and the kids love that, and that's everywhere. So, but you gotta try, you're not, you gotta, when all the publishers close their doors, like, okay, I'll just
and it is one of those things where it's like, I felt like even with publishers, I didn't mention this, between book 1 and book 2, I did arrange to have book 2 published by kind of a smaller comic company called Archaea Studios Press. And it was run by a friend of mine, actually, Mark Smiley, who started his own kind of publishing thing. It's who publishes Mouse Guard. So that was their big early hit. And then I think they started expanding, and I was always friends with him, and he liked Runner, so he wanted to publish that as well. So my book 2 was going to be published by them. And then they, started like picking up a whole bunch of other titles, which was in a way a little concerning for me. And then they all ended up selling to another publisher. And at that point, I kind of decided I wanted to try the webcomic route of just making my whole series available for free and try to build up an audience that way. But there is that concern for me with publishers, and I think other people in our group have mentioned this too, that, you know, sometimes you might think of the publisher as the only way to go, and going with the publisher is what's going to get your book seen. And sometimes I feel like they just have a lot of books that they're putting out, and they kind of they'll cover the printing, and then they'll just see what sticks. But they aren't necessarily positioning every book to succeed really well. Like they may not necessarily be actually doing the marketing for it. I've known people in our group who are having their books published by publishers, but the creators still have to do their own website, do their own marketing.
Yeah, that's what I'm like.
Which I mean, I haven't really worked with a publisher, so I don't know what they are supposed to be doing, but I always kind of thought the publisher would kind of try to handle marketing and promotion and get the book out there in front of as many faces as possible and eyes, and get it read. But that was one of my concerns with the Archaea Studios, that, you know, suddenly they had dozens of books that they were putting out, and it made me think, how is mine just going to be one of 40 books that you're putting out, or are you actually going to be pushing it to the right audience and trying to market it so that it can be successful? Because if you're not, then, and I'm doing all the marketing myself and all the promotion, and, you know, I'm the one trying to build it up and get it seen, then is all you're doing just covering the printing costs? Because
Yeah, no,
I could do Kickstarter and do that.
I've had that with, I mean, publishers like a small publisher, what's there, Schiffer, and then with Hyperion, which is Disney. I've had books, if they don't put anything behind it, it's just, I mean, back a couple of years ago, I was doing more the school visit circuit. I could sell books that way, but if I'm not doing school visits, I'm not promoting it, then it's just like, it's in their catalog, but it doesn't go anywhere, you know. It's just
right. And I don't mean for it to sound like I'm bashing publishers or anything. I just,
good to see both sides.
I think it's more about, like, if you're looking to get it published and sending out to publishers, and you find one that's interested, that's great. And if you don't, then I think, you know, there's definitely room for making a go of it yourself.
Yeah, no, I also think it's good to differentiate between getting it the first time, getting it published, getting it. I mean, that's like, you don't worry about the commercial, you don't worry about the selling it. You want to get it out there, you get the thrill. Once you're kind of in the business and doing it as a job, then you kind of think about these things. I think initially, especially, you know, I don't want to, like, again, muddy the waters and have people be bitter about how much they're going to sell. I mean, I think there's the thrill of getting something published is real, and that's kind of incomparable. So you're fortunate to get there to the point where you're worried about, you know, if it's actually, you know, an income stream, or where, you know, you do it for the love of it first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I still have this one photo that I keep in my phone of being at a convention, and like this guy and his 10-year-old daughter or something came up to the table, and he was saying how excited she was to, you know, like, I was one of the, you know, tables that she was most excited about coming to, because she loved the series, and, you know, she picked up one of the books and was holding it, you know,
oh, that's great,
chest, and so excited to read it. And, you know, it's that sort of thing where it's like, I don't have a huge audience, you know, right now, but there are a number who've read it and really, really love it. I've had some say, you know, it inspires their own writing, because they're writing their own books and just really appreciating the writing and the artwork. And, you know, I've had some people early on say, you know, this is what the Star Wars movie should have been, you know, the kind of fun and adventure. So, you know, even without having a huge audience or huge sales yet, hopefully, it is immensely rewarding to, you know, just be putting something out there that means something to you, that can actually, you know, mean something to other people, and at least be something that's very entertaining for them, or maybe even inspire them to want to, you know, do something similar.
Oh, sure, yeah. Okay, well, again, thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was
Yep,
fun.
you know.